Through education, research, scholarships, networking, and more, the institutes are unique in how they help and support insurance professionals, both today and into the future.
Thought Leader Theater is brought to you by the Institutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this session titled Global Risk Agility and Decision Making. My name is Dante Disparte, and I'm the founder and CEO of a DC-based risk advisory firm and brokerage called Risk Cooperative. And I'm also the chairperson of the Business Council for American Security, with a think tank that was started by Secretary of State John Kerry and the former Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, among others. So I spend a good amount of my time with the security people, the risk and the insurance people, and the business community. And so what I will discuss in this afternoon's presentation is some of the themes that are coming out in my upcoming book titled Global Risk Agility and Decision Making, which is due out later in the second quarter of this year. And I hope, of course, to run an interactive session, so stop me at any time with any questions that you might have. So some of the learning objectives for this session, some of the things we will talk about. The first one being is that I think we're entering a new era of risk, what I'm calling the great risk convergence. There's two big forces coming together, and how we contend with them in the industry and how we contend with them in business and policy is, I think, one of the central issues that organizations have to deal with. And then in the presentation, we'll do a couple of deep dives on some risk domains, many of which will feel like they're becoming the new normal, from climate change to cyber risk and a few others. And then we'll talk through some of the implications and ultimately the achievement of a new standard in risk and decision making, which implies that we're not just managing it, but that we're agile as organizations and as individual risk professionals in the face of an unprecedented change. So this is where we are. And it's a simple graph, but all of our industry, the entire risk profession, insurance, and the way we've approached risk has been geared to respond to natural risks, which are historically very predictable. We've advanced by great leaps and bounds in the financial markets with cat bonds and all kinds of different instruments, catastrophe modeling. We've advanced, and we have a lot of sophistication in how we're approaching natural risk. The challenge is this other element has entered the scene and in earnest probably over the last 30 years, and now I think the sinus curve on the way man-made risk is behaving is having some profound implications. And the one key difference between the two is that natural risks are capricious by nature, they're unpredictable, and they have no agency. They're not doing things by design, they're just emerging. Earthquakes, fires, these types of natural hazards are occurring, but they're not occurring with any design. And that's the main difference that we have to contend with in our profession, is that man-made risk, the actor that is trying to sow havoc and wreak havoc on an organization or an entity has agency, and there's a very deliberate property of that. I think there's both an opportunity and many risks that are associated with that, and in some respects, human behavior can be predictable, but it can also be incredibly complex, and that's one of the major issues organizations have to contend with. Nice little graph, and I'll explain it in a moment what it is. So this was the world in 1950, and I'm borrowing this from our friends at The Economist. So in 1950, there were two cities on the planet with more than 10 million people, what they call megacities, New York and Tokyo respectively. And as you might imagine, what happens as we advance each decade, you'll start to see there's almost an organic property in the development and how megacities have cropped up around the world. By 1970, there were 3. 1980, the number of megacities reaches 4, and then you could start to see the emerging pattern of where things are shifting. And the backdrop, of course, for this narrative is that with this shift in megacities, of course, you now have a shift in economic output, a shift in urbanization, and all kinds of consequences are coming as a result of that. By 1990, 2000, 2010, and then by 2020. So if we advance to 2030, and this may be a chart that some of you are familiar with, more people will live within that ring than outside of it. 95% of world consumption will be outside of North America. And effectively, there will be 8.5 billion people on the planet that we have to contend with. This becomes one of the major challenges and opportunities of our times. And with this shift, you give rise to a new type of humanity. Instead of Homo sapiens, which has been the predominant pattern of our species on Earth, you now have the rise of Homo urbanus, an urban man that is, everything is in our face in this environment. Part of the fuel, the tinder that ignited the Arab Spring was a combination of urbanization, high youth unemployment, a high school life expectancy, and an environment that was densely urbanized. So you couldn't necessarily separate haves from have-nots in Tunisia when the Arab Spring got started. Contrast it to Yemen. The Arab Spring as a revolution never quite took off because the urbanization levels in Yemen, contrasted to Tunisia, Egypt, and other countries, wasn't as profound. And so an urban world is an intensely volatile world, but I also think there are many opportunities that lie in it. One quick example of where I see an upside is in response to climate change. Irene and then Sandy, two freak storms occurred back to back. Sandy's impact on the East Coast, a very densely populated part of our country, I think is part of what's driving change in behavior in cities, and it's part of why we see a proliferation in city bikes across the United States, in major cities like New York, in DC, and others. And you see a big degree of adaptation in terms of transport. So the impacts of a changing world is no longer a remote Horn of Africa issue. It is now something that is being felt and therefore driving adaptation. And so as a backdrop to that story of intense urbanization, we then have what I'm titling here the wheel of misfortune, which I'm borrowing from the World Economic Forum. And what it does is it's pulled together a whole host of different risk factors in this nice complex diagram. And around it, you could start to see some of the impacts of the era of man-made risk. The EU's Schengen Agreement, which is an agreement in Europe that has stood fast since the Second World War and was meant to sow peace and transparency and stability in the free flow of trade, commerce, and people across EU's borders, has all but shattered in the face of mass migration and this current migration crisis that the EU is facing. And that's just going to become even more prevalent, and companies have to respond to that. They have to respond to that change. And just a quick example, last night I had the privilege of addressing a group of Danish firms, including Lego and many others that are visiting RIMS. And companies in this environment cannot decouple the behavior and the fortunes of their countries from the attitudes that their markets will have towards those companies. So you may recall many years ago, Denmark was thrust in the middle of a scandal over drawings of the Prophet Muhammad. And that had an immediate consequence on Danish exports, Danish firms, and all kinds of issues. In the same vein as when the United States is doing something that might fall astray around the world, McDonald's, the golden arches of McDonald's, despite whatever they may be doing with their risk management and their corporate citizenship, becomes an implied target in this very complex universe. So looking at one particular risk domain, climate change, 2014, the hottest instrumentally recorded year in history. 2015, in the US, 2015, the hottest ever. We've had the largest El Nino phenomenon in recorded history. The warmest single day in the Arctic in recorded history. The largest snowfall in Boston. Named freak storms year-round, just to, of course, embed this notion of resilience and preparedness at the household level. And it's not going to get any better. So every piece of research we read about climate change and about adaptation suggests that the 2-degree mark, the 2 degrees Celsius mark, is no longer the ceiling. It now looks like it's the floor. And that we have to now start to map out what the world looks like at 4 degrees Celsius. And what are the consequences both for business, for society, for governments, for politics, and then most importantly, in this context, for the risk-bearing industry and the risk professionals. And this is just a quick glimpse of what 1 degree looks like. That, 32, you have a block of ice. 1 degree more, you have a glass of water. And how does this translate in the real world? I think this is just one quick snapshot of that. That the prospect of an open ocean sea route over the North Pole is something we're all going to contend with in our lifetimes. It's not 100 years from today. It's probably within the next 10 to 20 years. There may be passages through the North Pole for large ocean-going vessels. In fact, as we speak, there's a geopolitical race, a land grab effectively taking place under the Arctic, where Russian submarines have planted flags, Norwegians are planting flags, and everybody's staking claim effectively to an underground treasure trove of resources, minerals, ocean routes, oil deposits, and many others. And this is, of course, very scary. Conservationists are not happy. None of us should be happy because the change is apparently irreversible. The question now becomes, how do we respond to it? What are the business opportunities? What are the risk management implications of the world that we're now in? And then when you consider cyber risk, and so incidentally, I'm really just talking about a handful of things that I would characterize as man-made risks. We could debate whether climate change is in fact man-made or not, but I think for the sake of this argument, we must look at all of these risks as risks that have actors that are deliberately driving them. And so cyber risk, of course, and I know you probably have heard a lot of it in the last few days at RIMS, in my mind, it is still, we're very much in the tip of the iceberg. It becomes the new normal. And besides thinking of the Internet of Things and the Internet of very large, complex devices like connected aircraft and GM vehicles being hacked successfully because of OnStar, the more ubiquitous the Internet becomes, the more we become exposed. So there's a much larger surface area for deliberate actors to potentially attack. Some of the alarming trends that I'm seeing are the rise of business models effectively being held for ransom. So if you think of Ashley Madison, it's probably not a name that will garner much favor because of their business model and what they did, but the implications are stark. Nobody attacked Ashley Madison for money, right? They didn't want any monetary return. They didn't want any monetary awards. Simply, they were trying to reveal the scope of what they did and the types of people that were using that service. And imagine what happens then when Philip Morris gets hacked because people are against cigarettes, and then that a company's fundamental purpose for existing is what folks are after. And I think that's just going to continue to evolve. Equally, national infrastructure, such as our energy grid, our telephone networks, and others, are incredibly vulnerable. And as a stark reminder of that, we have to look back to the 2003 Great Blackout. In 2003, a tree branch in Ohio brought a quarter of our energy grid to a halt. And for many days, that's all it took. 11 million people were plunged into darkness across the East Coast in Canada. And that was not a deliberate attack. That was just underperformance and bad maintenance, and nobody was out pruning trees. So imagine what happens when these types of things become very deliberate. And so the raging noise in the cyber domain is nation-state conflicts. Russia, they claim, has successfully launched an attack on Ukraine's energy grid, and increasingly these types of exposures are leaping from the virtual world into the real world with some real consequences. And a very brief example of that is the Stuxnet virus, which many claim the Israelis, in cooperation with the US, deployed against Iran's nuclear centrifuges and effectively made them spin out of control, causing physical loss. So cyber is not just intangible. Cyber has a quick ability to morph and a quick ability to affect physical assets and physical systems in some pretty profound ways. And then last but not least, I think one of the major ones is societal polarization and this otherness. That for all of the globalization and for all of the reality that we're living in Thomas Friedman's hot, flat, and crowded world, in many respects our world is becoming bigger rather than smaller, right? And that the more in your face our reality becomes, and the fact that the Mediterranean has now become the dividing line between a happy life and a well-off life in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe versus living like a refugee in the Levant, all of these types of pressures are now coming to a head. They've shattered NATO, they've shattered the Schengen Agreement, and it's affecting the way companies must respond, because it's not sufficient to say, I have insurance for that. Companies now need to take a footing of being much more activist and much more engaged in the world that is changing. Think of Fortress America. The notion that two great oceans protect our country no longer holds water against the threat of Zika virus, right? A microscopic threat doesn't respect the Department of Homeland Security or TSA. It just comes with global trade, global travel, and there's not much we could do about it except for not letting someone else's problem fester. We have to be much more engaged globally, both at the corporate level and at the national level. And then, you know, as if it were not enough for the risk manager in the room, every one of the things I've just described no longer confines, as they did in the era of natural risks, to nice silos. You simply cannot say, I've got my strategy for earthquakes and things like that. You also must respond to much more complexity and much more interrelationships between them. And as you look ahead 10 years, it just gets more and more complex, and this is according to, you know, surveys from the World Economic Forum. We're going to have to contend with water crises and many other issues, mass migration and things like this. So what is risk agility? And I'll try to do this swiftly, given time, and of course to allow for a few questions. To me, risk agility is where risk management may be a passive activity, and I'll give you one quick example. The principal instrument of risk transfer is an insurance policy, and it principally runs with similar conditions for a period of 12 months. And that assumes that risk remains constant, and that in fact you could buy a policy that says, I will do X in the event of Y. The assumption, of course, being that all those conditions remain constant over 12 months. And it just isn't. Risk is inherently volatile, and organizations need to do much more than just transfer it and buy insurance. They need to engage in a much more interactive decision-making process at all organizational levels. Very briefly, the first dimension here on this graph shows what risk management looks like in a financial services institution. Principally backward-looking, data-driven, incredibly mathematical and rigorous. And you go to any bank right now, and Jamie Dimon will be able to tell you his one-day value at risk and all kinds of quantitative approaches. The inherent difficulty is it's backward-looking, and it often suffers from confirmation bias. So you're answering complexity with complexity. In the manufacturing environment, like in Toyota's assembly line, risk management is very satisfactory, it's tangible, you could see errors in your business process. The issue might be that you have too much signal to noise ratio, and so people might be stopping the assembly line too quickly, too often. What we propose in our book is really this third dimension, sort of a blended approach between the two, and something that would make it everybody's business in an organization to stay in business, and not just the risk manager and the finance people. Another quick way to look at it is that along a statistical probability, and this is the only math you'll see today from me, is that, you know, on the higher likelihood, lower impact side of the spectrum, build these types of risks into your business or your pricing model because you could optimize them. And an example would be the warranty on a car. Lots of observations, lots of data. In the middle part are the unexpected losses, so what Rumsfeld would call the known unknowns. Those types of risks are the ones that you could predictably and knowingly transfer. This last stuff, this last bucket, the tail domain, is where the black swans start to occur. Instead of spending billions of dollars as we do in our industry trying to identify what those are, and the inherent truth is we don't know. They're risky and they're called risks for a reason because they're unpredictable. In that domain, the priority should shift from how do I identify what's going to happen here to how do I survive the catastrophic loss when it does occur. So, what are the key attributes of an agile risk manager? The first one is that their value systems are not meaningless words on a wall. So a quick example would be Tim Cook's position against the FBI. If you spoke to Tim Cook about it, he would say privacy matters above all else, even if it erodes shareholder value in the short run. They also stand for something organizationally and individually, and they're not afraid of taking decisions, even when they're counterintuitive and impact their organizations. They're entrepreneurial by nature, and they know the fine line between success and failure. And ultimately, they don't let bad news linger because it doesn't get better with time, as we all may know. So with that, I think that is the end of the presentation. All right, thank you.